There comes a moment when the very foundation of what you believed yourself to be begins to crack. Not dramatically, not with fanfare, but with the quiet persistence of water finding its way through stone. You feel it first as a subtle discomfort, a sense that the stories you've been telling yourself about meaning and purpose no longer hold their familiar weight. You might notice it during ordinary moments. While brushing your teeth, perhaps, or sitting in traffic, when suddenly the elaborate narrative of your life feels oddly transparent. Like looking at a movie screen and becoming aware, for the first time, of the projector casting images in the dark. This isn't depression, though it might masquerade as such. It isn't spiritual crisis, though the symptoms overlap. It's something far more fundamental and far more unsettling. The slow recognition that the searcher and the sought, the observer and the observed, the one who suffers and the suffering itself, were never actually separate to begin with. Most people, when this recognition begins to dawn, interpret it as a personal failing. They assume something has gone wrong with their motivation, their drive, their capacity for engagement with life. They reach for therapists, self-help books, meditation retreats, anything to restore the familiar sense of being a separate someone moving toward meaningful goals. But what if this interpretation is precisely backwards? What if the discomfort isn't a sign of malfunction, but of seeing clearly for the first time? The mechanism is both simple and devastating. For decades, perhaps your entire life, you've operated under the assumption that you are a distinct entity, navigating a world of other entities, pursuing objectives that will bring fulfillment to this central self. This assumption creates what we might call the project of becoming. There's always something to achieve, someone to become, some state to reach. The very structure of seeking gives life its apparent coherence and direction. But non-dual realization doesn't add something new to this structure. It reveals that the structure itself is a kind of optical illusion. There was never anyone separate enough to need improvement, never anywhere else to go, never any real distance between what you are and what you seek. The seeker dissolves into the seeking. The seeker dissolves into what is sought, and what remains is simply what was always already here. This recognition arrives like a master key that opens every lock in the house, only to reveal that the house was never locked to begin with. And here's where the first paradoxical struggle emerges. The very insight that should bring ultimate freedom instead brings a peculiar kind of suffering. Not the familiar suffering of wanting something you don't have, but the disorienting suffering of realizing there was never anyone there to have or not have anything at all. The pursuit of purpose becomes suddenly hollow. Goals that once felt urgent now seem like elaborate games played by children who have forgotten they are playing. Achievements taste like cardboard. The future, which once pulled you forward with magnetic force, flattens into an abstract concept with no real grip on your attention. You find yourself living in a world that operates entirely on the assumption of separation, while knowing, with uncomfortable clarity, that this assumption is false. This creates the second struggle, the impossibility of communicating your experience. How do you explain to someone that their deepest concerns are based on a case of mistaken identity? How do you participate in conversations about personal growth, career advancement, or relationship goals when these categories no longer make coherent sense? You begin to feel like an alien studying human behavior from the outside, simultaneously intimate with the species, yet unable to fully participate in its fundamental delusions. The third struggle is perhaps the cruelest, the recognition that you cannot go back. You cannot unknow what you now know. The comfortable ignorance of separation, with its built-in meaning-making machinery, is no longer available. You've eaten from the tree of non-dual knowledge, and the garden of purposeful seeking is forever closed to you. There's a profound grief in this, a mourning for the self you can never again believe yourself to be. Yet even as these recognitions unfold, a fourth struggle emerges, the tendency to make non-dual realization itself into a new project. The mind, desperate to restore its familiar patterns, begins to seek deeper awakening, more complete understanding, cleaner embodiment of non-dual truth. But this very seeking reveals that the seeker is still alive and well, still trying to get somewhere, still believing in the fundamental myth of separation. The snake of seeking swallows its own tail, and you find yourself caught in the paradox of trying to realize what is already fully present. The fifth struggle is social and relational. Other people continue to relate to you as if you were a separate person with personal desires, fears, and ambitions. They ask about your plans, your feelings, your opinions, and you find yourself in the strange position of having to invent a persona to engage with. It's not that you don't care about people. It's not that emotions don't arise. But the entire framework of individual psychology feels like a costume you put on for social occasion. Intimacy becomes complicated when there's no clear sense of who is being intimate with whom. The sixth struggle is perhaps the most practical. How do you make decisions from a place of no self? How do you choose a career, a relationship, a place to live when there's no clear center of preference making choices? Life continues to demand responses, but the response mechanism has been fundamentally altered. You find yourself making decisions not from desire or fear, but from something more like impersonal intelligence or natural unfolding. It works, but it feels nothing like the decisive agency you once imagined yourself to possess. The seventh and final struggle is the ultimate paradox, the recognition that even these struggles are simply more appearing appearances in consciousness, with no one there to be truly struggling with them. The one who would resolve these paradoxes is revealed to be part of the paradox itself. What remains is a kind of cosmic humor, a recognition that the entire drama of awakening and struggle, seeking and finding, was never happening to anyone at all. This is not a comfortable realization. Comfort, after all, requires someone to be comforted. Instead, it's more like space itself becoming aware of its own spaciousness, or silence recognizing its own depth. There's a quality of stark clarity to it, like mountain air that's almost too clean to breathe. The mind wants to make this into a teaching, a path, a method for others to follow. But non-dual realization resists systematization precisely because it reveals that there are no others to teach and nothing to learn that isn't already completely obvious. It's like trying to teach someone how to be themselves, or providing directions to their own location. What emerges from these seven struggles is not resolution in any conventional sense, but a kind of dynamic stability. Life continues, decisions get made, relationships unfold, but the fundamental anxiety of being a separate someone in a hostile universe dissolves. What remains is more like the relaxed alertness of space itself, aware but not concerned, present but not grasping, responsive but not reactive. The painful clarity of existential separation that replaced the pursuit of purpose reveals itself, finally, to be no separation at all. The pain was the last desperate attempt of the mind to maintain the illusion of someone there to be separate. When even that dissolves, what remains is too simple to be called an achievement and too obvious to be considered profound. You are exactly where you have always been, exactly what you have always been. And the long journey home reveals itself to have been a journey in place, elaborate circling that brings you back to the beginning, where you recognize the place for the first time. The seven struggles were not obstacles to overcome, but the very means by which what you are comes to recognize itself. Like a mirror, slowly cleaning its own surface until it reflects nothing but pure seeing itself. And yet, there's something almost mischievous about how this recognition arrives. It doesn't announce itself with trumpets or mystical visions. Instead, it seeps into ordinary moments like ink through paper, coloring the mundane with an impossible transparency. You might be washing dishes when it becomes suddenly clear that the washer, the washing, and the dishes are all movements within the same seamless wholeness. The boundary between subject and object doesn't dramatically collapse. It simply reveals itself to have been a useful fiction all along. This ordinariness of the extraordinary creates its own peculiar dissonance. The mind expects enlightenment to feel special, to confer some kind of elevated status or supernatural ability. But non-dual recognition is more like discovering you've been wearing shoes on the wrong feet your entire life. There's relief, certainly, but also a kind of cosmic embarrassment. How could something so obvious have been missed for so long? The eighth struggle, if we may call it that, emerges from this very ordinariness. because the realization doesn't elevate you above the human condition, doesn't exempt you from sadness or confusion or the need to pay bills. There's a temptation to doubt its authenticity. Surely true awakening would feel more awakened. Surely the end of seeking would be more dramatic than this quiet deflation of the seeker. But this is where the deepest paradox reveals itself. What you took to be awakening was actually a kind of falling asleep to the dream of separation. And what feels like disappointment is actually the end of the elaborate fantasy that there was somewhere else to go or someone else to become. The spiritual marketplace, with its promises of transformation and transcendence, suddenly appears as a collection of solutions to a problem that never actually existed. This creates a curious relationship with spiritual teachings and practices. You can see their function clearly now. They are skillful means for dissolving the very seeker who engages with them, like a medicine that cures by eliminating the patient, or a ladder that must be discarded once you realize you were never on the ground to begin with. There's gratitude for these pointers, but also a recognition of their ultimate redundancy. The social implications of this recognition extend far beyond awkward dinner conversations. The entire structure of human civilization is built upon the assumption of separate selves pursuing individual interests. Economics, politics, psychology, education, entertainment, all of it assumes the reality of the very separateness that has been seen through. You find yourself participating in systems you know to be based on a fundamental misunderstanding, like an actor who has forgotten this is a play but must continue performing to avoid confusing the other actors. This participation isn't hypocritical, it's compassionate, because you can see that others are genuinely suffering from the belief in separation, and that this suffering is entirely unnecessary, not because their problems aren't real within the dream of separateness, but because the dreamer was never real to begin with. You become like someone who knows the movie is a movie but doesn't want to spoil it for those who are still absorbed in the story. The impulse to help, to share, to somehow communicate this recognition becomes its own form of seeking. But how do you point to what is already completely present? How do you teach the absence of a student? How do you guide someone to where they already are? It's like trying to give directions to someone for a journey that ends where it begins, using a map that shows only their current location. This is where the deepest compassion emerges, not as an emotion felt by someone for someone else, but as the natural expression of unity recognizing itself. When the boundaries between self and other are seen through, what remains isn't indifference, but its opposite. A love so complete it includes everything without preference. Pain doesn't disappear from life, but the one who would be separate from pain does. Joy doesn't become permanent, but the one who would grasp at joy dissolves. What's remarkable is how life reorganizes itself around this absence of a center. Decisions arise from intelligence rather than desire. Actions emerge from what the situation requires rather than what a personal self wants. It's not that preferences disappear entirely, but they're held lightly, like suggestions rather than commands. You might still prefer chocolate to vanilla, but there's no chocolate-preferring entity that needs defending or satisfying. The body continues its biological imperatives. The mind continues its thinking patterns. Emotions continue their flowing and ebbing. But the central headquarters that was supposedly coordinating all this activity is found to have been empty all along. The company was running itself. The show was directing itself. The dream was dreaming itself. And what you took to be the dreamer was just another character in the dream. This revelation brings a quality of profound rest that has nothing to do with physical relaxation. It's the rest of no longer having to be anyone in particular, no longer having to maintain a consistent self-image, no longer having to defend a position you never actually occupied, the exhaustion you didn't realize you were carrying, the constant effort of being a separate self in an alien universe, simply dissolves. And perhaps most paradoxically, this dissolution of the personal self doesn't make you less human, but more authentically human. Without the armor of a defended identity, what remains is more vulnerable, more responsive, more genuinely present to whatever is arising. The personality doesn't disappear, but becomes transparent, like a window that no longer notices itself because it's too busy letting light through. The 7 struggles transform into a single recognition. They were never happening to anyone to begin with. They were consciousness exploring the full implications of imagining itself to be separate. Like an actor so committed to their role, they temporarily forget their acting. The struggles were the method by which this forgetting was gradually remembered, this sleep gradually awakened from. What remains is too intimate to be called knowledge and too obvious to be called wisdom. It's more like breathing, recognizing itself as breath, or space, becoming aware of its own spaciousness. The seeker was never real, but the seeking was the very movement by which what is real comes to know itself. And knowing itself, it laughs at the elaborate game of hide and seek it was playing with itself all along. This laughter isn't cruel or dismissive. It's the laughter of coming home after a long journey to discover you never left. The laughter of finding your glasses on your head after searching the entire house. It's the laughter of recognizing that the very one who was seeking enlightenment was the only thing standing in the way of the enlightenment that was already completely present. And in this laughter, even the 7 paradoxical struggles reveal themselves as perfect expressions of what you are. Temporary movements in the same consciousness that is reading these words right now, recognizing itself in the mirror of its own awareness, wondering how it could have ever believed itself to be anything other than this boundless, seamless, ever-present wholeness that needs nothing and lacks nothing, and is nothing other than what it has always been. The recognition settles like dust after a windstorm. And what becomes apparent is how thoroughly this seeing permeates every corner of experience. You cannot quarantine non-dual awareness to meditation cushions or spiritual discussions. It seeps into the mundane architecture of daily life like water, finding every crack in a foundation. When you reach for a cup of coffee, there's no clear boundary between the reacher and the reaching, the grasper and the grasping. The simple act reveals itself as a seamless unfolding within consciousness, rather than the action of a separate entity manipulating objects in space. Even this description feels clumsy, like trying to explain the wetness of water to someone who has never been dry. The mind, confronted with this seamlessness, performs increasingly desperate gymnastics to restore the familiar subject-object structure. It creates subtle narratives. I am the aware one noticing the absence of separation. But even this witnessing consciousness, this one who is aware of awareness itself, dissolves under scrutiny. There's no findable center from which witnessing occurs. Only witnessing itself, owning no one, belonging nowhere, requiring nothing. This creates what we might call the 9th struggle, though numbering them now seems arbitrary. The complete demolition of spiritual identity. The part of you that took pride in being awake, that felt special for seeing through illusion, that imagined itself more evolved than those still caught in separation. This spiritual ego doesn't gradually diminish, but suddenly reveals itself to be made of the same insubstantial stuff as the ego it replaced. There's a peculiar grief in this recognition. The spiritual seeker, with all its noble aspirations and hard-won insights, was still seeking, still believing in the fundamental myth of incompleteness. The one who thought they had transcended the ego was simply ego wearing transcendent clothes. This isn't a moral failing but a cosmic joke, and you're simultaneously the comedian and the punchline. What emerges from this demolition is something the mind cannot categorize. It's not enlightenment because there's no one enlightened. It's not awakening because there's no one who was asleep. It's not realization because there's nothing that wasn't already completely obvious. Yet life continues with a quality of groundless transparency, like walking on air, that perfectly supports each step. The practical implications ripple outward in unexpected ways. Work continues, but the worker has vanished. Conversations happen, but there's no conversationalist. Love flows, but there's no lover holding back or pushing forward. It's all happening by itself, to no one, for no particular reason, with a spontaneous intelligence that makes personal decision-making seem quaint by comparison. This spontaneous intelligence doesn't feel mystical or otherworldly. It's more like discovering that your body was already breathing perfectly without your conscious management, that your heart was beating with precise rhythm without your oversight, that life was living itself with an elegance that personal control could only interfere with. The micromanager of consciousness, the one who thought they needed to direct experience, simply clocks out for good. But here's where the subtlest trap emerges. The mind, ever resourceful, begins to make this spontaneous living into a new practice. I will surrender control. I will trust the natural flow. I will let life live itself through me. But who is this I that will surrender? Who is making the decision to trust? The very one who would practice non-doing is the obstacle to the effortlessness that's already occurring. This creates a kind of paradoxical paralysis. Any effort to be effortless is effort. Any attempt to surrender is an assertion of the surrenderer. Any practice of non-practice is still practicing. You find yourself in the position of a wave trying to become wet, or space attempting to become spacious. The very seeking for what you already are obscures what you already are. The resolution, when it comes, arrives not as a solution but as the dissolution of the problem. The wave doesn't become wet. It recognizes its essential wetness. Space doesn't achieve spaciousness. It notices it was never anything but space. And consciousness doesn't attain enlightenment. It sees through the one who was seeking enlightenment. This seeing through is remarkably undramatic. No bells ring, no angels sing, no cosmic downloads occur. Instead, there's a quality of profound ordinariness, like noticing you've been looking for your glasses while wearing them. The extraordinary was hiding in plain sight as the utterly ordinary. What you sought in peak experiences was present in every mundane moment. What you hoped to find in transcendence was completely available in the simple fact of being aware right now. The implications for relationships become increasingly apparent. When there's no solid self to defend or project, intimate connection becomes possible in a way that was unimaginable before. You can meet others without the elaborate dance of personas protecting themselves from other personas. What remains is a kind of transparent availability, a meeting that occurs prior to the stories both people tell about themselves. This doesn't make relationships easier. In some ways, it makes them more challenging. Others continue to relate to you as if you were a consistent someone with predictable preferences and reactions. They want to know what you think, how you feel, what you believe, and you find yourself reaching for answers that no longer feel quite accurate. It's not that thoughts don't arise or feelings don't flow, but they're no longer owned by anyone in particular. You begin to relate to your own personality the way you might relate to weather patterns, interesting phenomena that arise and pass away without requiring management or identification. Anger might arise without an angry person. Sadness might flow without anyone being fundamentally sad. Joy might bloom without someone being joyful. Emotions become like clouds passing through empty sky, temporarily coloring the vastness but never actually touching its essential clarity. This creates a unique form of intimacy with life itself. Without the buffer of a separate self, experience becomes immediated, direct, unavoidable. Pain doesn't feel like something happening to you, it simply hurts. Beauty doesn't feel like something you're observing, it simply shines. The mediating layer of the experiencer dissolves, leaving pure experiencing. Yet even this description misses the mark, because it implies there's still experiencing happening to no one, which creates a subtle duality between experience and the absence of an experiencer. In truth, there's no experience separate from the experiencer, and no experiencer separate from experience. There's just this seamless happening that can't be divided into components without losing its essential wholeness. The mind rebels against this seamlessness. It wants categories, boundaries, explanations. It wants to know who is aware of awareness, what is conscious of consciousness, where the witness stands in relation to the witnessed. But every question reveals its own groundlessness. Awareness is not aware of something, it's the very fabric of what appears to be something. Consciousness is not conscious of objects, it's the space in which the appearance of objects occurs. This recognition brings a quality of existential humor that's impossible to communicate to those still seeking. It's the humor of recognizing that what you spent years trying to achieve was what you were all along. What you hoped to become, you already were. What you sought to find was never lost. The journey was circular, the destination was the starting point, and the path was an elaborate detour through imaginary landscapes. But this humor isn't dismissive of the seeking. The seeking was perfect, necessary, the very mechanism by which what you are comes to recognize itself. Like a wave that must explore every part of the ocean before recognizing it was always ocean, consciousness must investigate every corner of apparent separation before seeing through the appearance to its own seamless nature. The wave doesn't transcend the ocean, it recognizes its ocean nature. The dream figure doesn't escape the dream, it awakens as the dreaming itself. And the seeker doesn't find what they seek. They dissolve into the very seeking that was occurring all along, revealing it to be the activity of what they sought. What remains is too ordinary to be called realization and too obvious to be considered an achievement. It's like returning home after a long journey to find that home is exactly as you left it, except now you can see it clearly for the first time. The familiar becomes transparent. The ordinary becomes luminous. The obvious becomes miraculous simply by being recognized as obvious. And in this recognition, the 7 paradoxical struggles reveal their ultimate function. They were not problems to be solved, but invitations to see through the problem solver. They were not obstacles to overcome, but the very path by which the overcomer is dissolved. They were perfect expressions of consciousness, exploring the implications of imagining itself to be separate, like an actor so committed to their role that they temporarily forget their acting. The play continues, but the actor has awakened within the play, no longer mistaking themselves for the character they portray. The drama unfolds, but the one who was taking it personally has dissolved back into the impersonal intelligence that was writing the script all along. What you took to be your life reveals itself to be life itself, temporarily focused through the lens of apparent individuality. Now recognizing its own boundless nature, looking back at itself through countless eyes, including the eyes that are reading these words right now.